On the most important day of my life, my parents didn't show up. But what happened next turned my silent pain into a moment the whole world couldn't ignore. Disclaimer: this story is completely fictional and creative entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and situations are imaginary and do not relate to any real person or real-life incident. The auditorium was already full by the time I arrived, buzzing with excitement that almost felt alive. People were laughing, talking loudly, adjusting their gowns, and taking pictures as if they were trying to capture every second before it slipped away. The bright lights reflected off the polished floor, and the stage at the front looked grand, decorated with banners and flowers that made everything feel important, almost unreal. This was the day everyone had worked so hard for, the day that was supposed to mark the beginning of something new. As I stepped inside, I tried to take it all in, telling myself to feel proud, to feel happy, but something inside me felt unsettled. I walked slowly down the aisle, my eyes scanning the rows of seats where families were already gathered. Parents leaned toward their children, fixing their caps, brushing imaginary dust off their shoulders, whispering words that were probably full of encouragement and pride. Some were holding bouquets, others had cameras ready, their fingers hovering over buttons, waiting for the perfect moment. There were smiles everywhere, the kind that came from shared memories and years of support. I tried to smile too, but it didn't come naturally. My gaze shifted toward the front row, where I had reserved 2 seats days ago. I had chosen them carefully, thinking my parents would want the best view, thinking they would want to see every detail of the moment I walked across that stage. The seats were easy to spot because they were still empty, standing out in a sea of people. At first, I told myself they were just late. It wasn't unusual. They had always been busy, always caught up in something important. I took a deep breath and sat down, keeping my eyes fixed on those seats as if staring at them long enough would somehow make my parents appear. Minutes passed, and the noise in the room grew louder as more people filled in. Every time the doors at the back opened, my heart jumped. I turned quickly, hoping to catch a glimpse of them walking in, slightly rushed, maybe apologizing with a wave or a smile. But each time it was someone else. Another proud family, another group of people who had made it on time. I checked my phone, hoping for a message, an explanation, anything. The screen stayed blank. I remembered the night before, when they had promised they would be there. They had said it casually, like it was obvious, like there was no chance they would miss it. I had believed them, even though part of me knew better. There had been other moments before, events, celebrations, times when I had looked for them in a crowd and found nothing but empty space. Still, this felt different. This was graduation, this was supposed to matter. The ceremony began with music that echoed through the hall, pulling everyone's attention toward the stage. People stood, clapped, and cheered as the faculty walked in, followed by the students. I moved with the crowd, trying to stay present, trying not to let my thoughts drift back to those 2 empty seats. But it was impossible to ignore them. They felt like a weight pressing down on me, a constant reminder of what was missing. As speeches started, I tried to listen, but the words blurred together, something about hard work, dedication, and bright futures. The audience responded at the right moments, laughing, clapping, nodding. But I felt disconnected, like I was watching everything from a distance. My attention kept returning to the front row. The seats were still empty, untouched, as if they had been forgotten. I told myself not to care. I told myself that I had made it this far on my own, that their absence didn't change anything. But the truth was harder to ignore. I had wanted them there. I had imagined this day so many times, pictured their faces in the crowd, their smiles, their pride. That image was so clear in my mind that the reality felt almost unreal, like something had gone wrong in a story that was supposed to have a different ending. When the names began to be called, the energy in the room shifted. One by one, students walked across the stage, each moment marked by applause, cheers, sometimes even loud shouts from families who couldn't contain their excitement. It was a celebration, loud and full of life. I clapped for others, forcing my hands to move, trying to be part of the moment even as something inside me felt distant. Then my name was called. For a second, everything slowed down. I stood up, feeling the weight of every step as I walked toward the stage. The lights seemed brighter, the room larger, the noise louder. I glanced one last time at the front row, at those 2 empty seats, hoping against all logic that something had changed. But they were still empty. As I walked across the stage, I could hear applause, but it felt scattered, unfamiliar. There were no voices calling my name, no cheers that stood out, no sound that felt like it belonged to me. I accepted my diploma, shook hands, and turned to face the audience for a brief moment. From up there, I could see everything clearly. The smiling faces, the proud families, the cameras flashing. And those 2 empty seats. In that moment, something shifted inside me. The sadness didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became quieter, heavier, harder. I walked back to my seat, holding my diploma tightly, not because I was proud, but because it felt like the only thing I had to hold on to. The ceremony continued, but I barely noticed. The cheers, the speeches, the celebration, all of it faded into the background as one thought stayed clear in my mind. They didn't come. The promise had been simple, almost casual, the kind people make without thinking twice. We'll be there. My parents had said the night before, as if it was guaranteed, as if nothing in the world could possibly get in the way. I had stood there, listening, searching their faces for any sign of doubt, but there was none. They looked certain, confident, like this was just another thing they would show up for. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe them completely. That belief stayed with me through the night and into the morning. I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had to, but because I couldn't sleep anymore. My mind was already racing, replaying Eden that had led up to this day. Years of studying, late nights, sacrifices I had made quietly without expecting recognition. Today was supposed to be the moment it all came together, the moment that would make everything feel worth it. And more than anything, I wanted them to see it. I got ready slowly, carefully adjusting my outfit, making sure everything looked right. It wasn't about impressing anyone else. It was about them. I wanted them to look at me and feel proud, to realize that all those years had meant something. Before leaving, I checked my phone half, expecting a message from them. Maybe a simple, "We're on our way," or "See you there." There was nothing. At first, I didn't think much of it. They were probably busy getting ready. Maybe they were running a little late. That was normal for them. I told myself not to overthink it. But as time passed, a quiet unease began to settle in. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was subtle, like a small crack forming beneath the surface. On the way to the ceremony, I tried calling them. The phone rang longer than usual before going silent. No answer. I tried again, telling myself maybe they just missed the call. The same result. I stared at the screen for a moment, then typed a message. "Are you on your way?" I watched as it sent, hoping to see those 3 dots appear, hoping for any kind of response. Nothing came. By the time I reached the venue, that unease had grown into something harder to ignore. I kept checking my phone, refreshing the screen as if that would somehow make a message appear. People around me were excited, talking about their families, pointing out where they were sitting, making plans for after the ceremony. Their voices blended into a constant noise that I couldn't fully focus on. I found my seat and looked toward the entrance, telling myself they would walk in at any moment. Maybe they were stuck in traffic. Maybe something unexpected had come up. There were always reasons, always explanations. That's what I had learned over the years. To fill in the silence with excuses that made their absence easier to accept. But deep down, I knew this feeling. It wasn't new. It was familiar in a way that made it harder to ignore. There had been other moments, other promises that had sounded just as certain and ended the same way. School events, small achievements, even simple things that had mattered to me more than they ever realized. Each time, I had told myself it wasn't a big deal, that they were just busy, that life was complicated. Each time, I had pushed the disappointment aside and moved on. This time felt different, not because of what had happened, but because of what it meant. This wasn't just another event. This was the result of everything I had worked for. And they knew that. They had always talked about how important education was, how it would shape my future, how it was the one thing no one could take away from me. They had said those words so many times that I had started to believe they truly cared. As the ceremony got closer to starting, I tried calling one last time. The phone didn't even ring this time. It went straight to silence. I stared at it, feeling something shift inside me. The unease turned into something heavier, something colder. It wasn't just disappointment anymore. It was realization. I thought about all the times I had waited for them, all the moments I had hoped they would show up and prove me wrong. I thought about how I had kept giving them chances, kept believing that the next time would be different. But standing there, holding my phone with no response, it became harder to hold on to that belief. Around me, the excitement continued to build. People were laughing, taking pictures, sharing moments that would become memories they could look back on with happiness. I tried to focus on that, to remind myself that this day was still important, that it still meant something regardless of who was there. But the feeling inside me refused to fade. It wasn't just about them missing the ceremony. It was about what their absence represented. It was about the quiet message it sent, one that didn't need words to be understood. I had spent years trying to earn their attention, their approval, their presence. And somehow it still wasn't enough. As I sat there waiting for something that wasn't coming, I felt a change I couldn't fully explain. The sadness was still there, but it was no longer the strongest emotion. Something else was taking its place, something sharper, more controlled. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, steady, and certain. For the first time, I stopped making excuses for them. I stopped trying to justify their absence or soften the reality of it. I saw it clearly, without any filters or hopeful thinking. They had made a choice, and that choice didn't include me. That realization didn't break me the way I expected it to. Instead, it settled in, heavy but solid, like a truth I could finally stop running from. The waiting ended in that moment, replaced by something that felt stronger, even if it was harder to understand. As the ceremony began and the room filled with applause, I sat there with a calm I hadn't felt before. It wasn't peace, not exactly. It was something colder, something that didn't depend on anyone else anymore. And in that quiet shift, something inside me started to change into something my parents had never seen before. The energy in the auditorium shifted the moment the keynote speaker was announced. Conversations softened, the scattered noise settled, and a quiet sense of anticipation spread across the room. This wasn't just any speaker. Everyone knew their name, their reputation, their influence. They were the kind of person people listened to carefully, the kind of person whose words stayed with you long after they were spoken. Even I had heard about them before, seen clips of their speeches online, admired the way they spoke with confidence and purpose. As they walked onto the stage, the applause grew louder, more unified, filling the entire space with a kind of respect that didn't need to be forced. People leaned forward in their seats, some lifting their phones to record, others simply watching with full attention. There was something about their presence that demanded focus without effort. They didn't rush. Every step they took seemed measured, calm, completely in control. I tried to focus on them, to shift my attention away from everything that had been building inside me. For a moment, it worked. Their voice was steady and clear, carrying easily across the room without needing to be loud. They began with the usual things: hard work, determination, the value of education. It was the kind of speech everyone expected, the kind that fit perfectly into a day like this. People nodded along, occasionally clapping at the right moments, fully engaged. I sat there, listening, but only partially. Part of me was still stuck in the earlier moments, still replaying the empty seats, the unanswered calls, the silence that had followed me all day. I tried to push it aside, telling myself to stay present, to at least take something from this moment. This was supposed to be a celebration, after all. The speaker continued, sharing stories of struggle and success, of people who had overcome challenges and built something meaningful from nothing. Their words were powerful, carefully chosen, delivered with a kind of authenticity that made them feel real. It wasn't just a speech, it felt like a conversation with the entire room. Even I found myself drawn in, despite everything. Then something changed. It wasn't obvious at first. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable. The speaker paused for a moment longer than usual, their expression shifting slightly, as if they were considering something beyond the prepared speech. The room grew quieter, the audience sensing that something different was about to happen. When they spoke again, their tone had changed. It was still calm, still controlled, but there was a new weight behind the words. "Today is a day of achievement," they said slowly. "A day that represents years of effort, sacrifice, and dedication." The audience nodded, some clapping softly in agreement. "But it's also a day that should be shared," they continued, their gaze moving across the room, as if searching for something, or someone. I felt a strange tension build in my chest, though I didn't understand why. "This moment isn't just about the students," they said. "It's about the people who supported them, who showed up when it mattered most." Something about those words felt different. They didn't sound like part of a general speech anymore. They felt specific, intentional. Without realizing it, I straightened in my seat, my attention sharpening. The speaker paused again, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be noticeable. The entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, they looked in my direction. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. There were hundreds of people in the room. Their gaze could have landed anywhere. But it didn't move. It stayed steady and focused, in a way that made it impossible to ignore. A strange feeling washed over me, a mix of confusion and something else I couldn't quite name. I glanced around briefly, half expecting them to be looking at someone else, but no one nearby seemed to react. It felt like, for a moment, the connection was direct. Then they spoke again. "There are times," they said, their voice quieter now, more deliberate, "when someone gives everything they have to reach a moment like this, and the people they hoped would be there aren't." My heart started to race. I didn't want to assume anything. I didn't want to believe that this had anything to do with me. But the words felt too close, too familiar, as if they were reaching into something I had been trying to keep hidden. The speaker took a step forward, their presence somehow even stronger despite the softer tone. "And in those moments," they continued, "it's easy to feel like all that effort, all that sacrifice went unnoticed." The room was completely silent now. No movement, no whispers, no distractions. Just their voice, steady and clear. I felt my hands tighten slightly in my lap, my thoughts beginning to race. How could they know something like this? It didn't make sense. I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't shared this with anyone at all. Yet the words kept coming, each one landing with a kind of precision that made it impossible to ignore. "But let me tell you something," they said, their voice firm again. "Your worth is not defined by who shows up for you, or who doesn't." Something shifted inside me as I heard that. It wasn't a complete change, not yet, but it was enough to make me listen more closely, to feel something beyond the heaviness that had been sitting there all day. The speaker's gaze finally moved, sweeping across the rest of the audience, but the impact of that moment stayed with me. It lingered, like an unanswered question, like a door that had just been opened without explanation. I sat there, trying to process what had just happened, my mind searching for a reason, anything that could explain how a stranger on a stage could speak words that felt so personal, so accurate. And deep down, beneath the confusion and the growing sense of unease, one thought kept pushing its way forward. This wasn't a coincidence. The speaker stood still for a moment after those last words, allowing the silence to settle deeper into the room. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt empty. It was heavy, filled with attention, as if every person in the auditorium was waiting for what would come next. No one shifted in their seats, no one whispered. Even the small sounds that usually filled a crowded space seemed to disappear. Then the speaker continued, their voice calm but carrying a different kind of intensity. "Let me tell you a story," they said. A soft murmur moved through the audience, not loud enough to break the silence, but enough to show curiosity. People leaned forward slightly, their interest growing. Stories had a way of connecting people, of pulling them in without effort. And this speaker knew exactly how to use that. I sat still, my attention locked in place. Something about the way they said those words made my chest tighten again, that same strange feeling returning, stronger this time. There was a student. The speaker began slowly, someone who worked harder than anyone around them. The words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind of weight that made you listen more closely, even if you didn't know why. This student didn't have everything handed to them. They had to earn every step, every opportunity, every small victory. I swallowed quietly, my throat suddenly dry. There was nothing unusual about the story on the surface. It could have been about anyone in the room. Many students had struggled, had worked hard to reach this day. But something about the way it was being told felt different. This student stayed up late when no one was watching. The speaker continued, their tone steady. They kept going even when it felt like no one noticed. Even when it seemed like the effort might not matter to anyone else. A faint ripple of recognition passed through me. I shifted slightly in my seat, trying to shake the feeling, trying to convince myself that I was just overthinking it. The speaker took a small step across the stage, their presence commanding even without raising their voice. And through all of it, they said, they held on to one hope that one day, the people they cared about most would finally see them, would finally understand. My fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of my gown. My thoughts began to move faster, connecting pieces I didn't want to connect. This student had one particular day in mind, the speaker went on. A day that would represent everything they had worked for, a day they believed would be shared with the people who mattered most. The audience was completely silent now, fully drawn into the story. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity. It was a powerful story, even without knowing who it was about. But I felt something else, something sharper, because I knew this story. Or at least, I was starting to. They invited their parents, the speaker said, pausing briefly before continuing. They made sure everything was perfect. They believed, without a doubt, that this time their parents would be there. My heart began to pound harder, each word landing heavier than the last. I stared straight ahead, unable to look away, unable to break free from the moment. The speaker's voice softened slightly, but it didn't lose its strength. But when the day finally came, they said, those parents never showed up. A quiet gasp moved through parts of the audience, small but noticeable, the kind of reaction that came from shared understanding, from imagining what that must feel like. For me, it wasn't imagination, it was reality. I felt the air around me grow heavier, harder to breathe. My mind raced, trying to deny what was becoming clearer with every second. This couldn't be about me. It didn't make sense. There were too many people, too many possibilities. It could still be a coincidence. But the details were too precise, too familiar, too real. The speaker didn't rush. They let the weight of those words settle before continuing. And that student, they said quietly, sat there, surrounded by celebration while feeling completely alone. I felt a sharp pressure in my chest, like something inside me had been exposed without warning. My hands stayed still, but I could feel the tension running through them, the effort it took to remain composed. Around me, people shifted slightly, reacting to the story. Some looked down, others glanced around as if trying to find the student being described. They didn't know, they couldn't know. But I did, and that realization made everything feel sharper, more intense. The speaker's voice grew stronger again, not louder, but more certain. From the outside, everything looked perfect. They continued. The ceremony, the applause, the achievements. But inside, that student was carrying a silence no one else could hear. Each sentence felt like it was peeling back something I had tried to keep hidden, something I hadn't even fully admitted to myself. I had felt that silence. I was still feeling it. The speaker stopped walking and faced the audience directly, their expression serious now, focused. And the hardest part, they said, was not the absence itself, but what it meant. A long pause followed, stretching just enough to let the meaning sink in. That sometimes, the people you hope will show up for you choose not to. The words didn't need to be louder. They didn't need emphasis. The truth in them was enough. I felt something shift again, deeper this time, not just recognition, but certainty. This wasn't just a general story meant to inspire. It wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. It was too exact, too specific, too closely tied to everything I had experienced. My thoughts circled rapidly, searching for answers, for explanations that could make sense of this moment. How could the speaker know something so personal? How could they stand there, in front of everyone, and tell a story that felt like it had been taken directly from my life? I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't shared this pain, this disappointment, this quiet hurt that had followed me for so long. It had been mine alone, something I carried without showing. And yet here it was, being spoken out loud, turned into a story for everyone to hear. The audience remained silent, completely absorbed, unaware of the truth behind the words. To them, it was just a powerful story, something emotional, something meaningful. But to me, it was something else entirely. It was exposure, it was recognition. It was something I couldn't ignore no matter how much I wanted to. As the speaker prepared to continue, I felt a growing certainty settle in, replacing the confusion that had been there before. This story wasn't just similar to mine. It was mine. The silence in the auditorium had reached a point where it almost felt fragile, like even the smallest sound could break it. Every person in the room was focused on the speaker, drawn in completely by the story that had unfolded. What had started as a typical graduation speech had turned into something far more personal, far more intense. The atmosphere had shifted, and everyone could feel it, even if they didn't fully understand why. The speaker stood still for a moment, their gaze steady as they looked out over the audience. There was no hesitation in their expression, no sign that they were about to return to a safer, more expected topic. Instead, there was a quiet certain if they had made a decision and were fully committed to it. When they spoke again, their voice carried a sharper edge, not in volume, but in meaning. Stories like this are often left unfinished, they said. People hear about the struggle, the disappointment, and then they move on. A few people shifted slightly in their seats, sensing that something more direct was coming. But today, the speaker continued, "I'm not going to leave this one unfinished." The words settled heavily in the room, creating a tension that hadn't been there before. It was no longer just a story being told for inspiration. It was becoming something else, something more confrontational. I felt my body go still, every part of me alert, as if bracing for what was about to happen. There was no doubt left in my mind now. This wasn't general. This wasn't vague. It was specific, intentional, and moving towards something I couldn't yet fully see. The speaker took a slow breath, their eyes scanning the audience again, more deliberately this time. Because the truth is, they said, this isn't just about one student. It's about something bigger. There was a pause, just long enough to let curiosity build, to pull everyone in even closer. It's about responsibility. They added, about showing up when it matters most. A quiet murmur moved through the crowd, subtle but noticeable. People were beginning to understand that this was no longer just a motivational speech. It was a message directed at someone, or perhaps many people. Then the speaker's tone changed again, becoming firmer, more direct. Some people believe that providing the basics is enough, they said. That as long as they fulfill certain roles, their presence isn't necessary. The words landed with a kind of precision that made them impossible to ignore. But moments like this prove otherwise. I felt a tightening in my chest, my attention completely locked on the stage. The air felt heavier, as if the entire room was holding its breath without realizing it. The speaker took a small step forward, their presence commanding in a way that didn't need volume or force. Because what matters most, they said, is not just what you give, but whether you are there when it counts. A few people nodded slowly, others sat completely still, absorbing every word. The message was clear now, even if it hadn't been stated outright. And then, without warning, the speaker crossed that final line. Today, they said, their voice steady and unwavering, there are parents who were invited to witness one of the most important moments in their child's life, and they chose not to come. The words seemed to echo through the auditorium, heavier than anything that had been said before. A visible reaction moved through the audience. People shifting, exchanging brief glances, some looking toward the front rows as if trying to piece together what was happening. I felt my heartbeat quicken, each second stretching longer than it should. This was no longer indirect. It was clear, undeniable. The speaker didn't stop. They had the opportunity, they continued, to stand in this room, to show their child that their effort mattered, and they didn't take it. The tension in the room deepened. It was no longer just emotional. It was uncomfortable. People weren't just listening anymore. They were reacting, even if silently. And to those parents, the speaker said, their voice firm, carrying across every corner of the auditorium, "You need to understand something." The pause that followed felt endless. "Your absence speaks louder than any words you could have said." A ripple of quiet shock moved through the audience. No one expected this. Not at a graduation. Not in a moment that was supposed to be purely celebratory. The speaker's gaze remained steady, their expression serious, unyielding. "You may think this is just one day," they continued. "Just one event in a long list of responsibilities and priorities." Their tone sharpened slightly, not with anger, but with conviction. "But for your child, this is not just a day. This is a memory they will carry for the rest of their life." The room was completely still now, the weight of those words settling into every corner. "And right now," the speaker added, "that memory includes empty seats." I felt something tighten inside me, the reality of those words hitting harder than anything before. It wasn't just a description anymore. It was a direct acknowledgement, spoken out loud in a room full of people. The speaker didn't raise their voice, but the impact of what they said didn't need volume. If you are those parents, they said slowly, each word deliberate, then you need to ask yourself a simple question. Another pause, longer this time, stretching the tension to its peak. What mattered more than being here today? No one moved, no one spoke. The question hung in the air, unanswered, unavoidable. And then came the moment that changed everything. The speaker straightened slightly, their expression firm, their voice carrying a final, undeniable clarity. Because whatever that reason is, they said, it will never be more important than what you chose to miss. A quiet wave of reaction moved through the audience, subtle but powerful. People understood the message now, fully and completely, but the speaker wasn't finished. They looked out across the room one last time, their gaze unwavering, their tone steady. And if you are hearing this, they said, if you are watching this later, if this message reaches you in any way, the pause that followed felt like the final breath before something irreversible. You should be ashamed. The words landed with a force that didn't need to be loud. They were clear, direct, and impossible to ignore. A stunned silence filled the auditorium, heavier than anything that had come before. No applause followed. No immediate reaction broke the moment. Just stillness, and in that stillness something had changed. Not just for me, but for everyone who had just witnessed what was no longer just a speech, but a public truth laid bare in front of them all. When the ceremony finally ended, the applause returned, but it felt different now, less natural, almost uncertain. People clapped, stood up, and began to move around, yet there was a lingering tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Conversations started again, but many were quieter, more focused, as if everyone was trying to process what they had just witnessed. The speech had left a mark, and it was clear that it wasn't something people would easily forget. I stayed in my seat for a moment longer than everyone else, my hands resting on the diploma in my lap. The noise around me felt distant, like it belonged to another space entirely. My mind kept replaying the words, the pauses, the way the speaker had looked directly at me. It all felt too precise to be accidental, too intentional to ignore. There was a reason behind it, something I couldn't yet see clearly, but I knew it was there. Eventually, I stood up and began to walk toward the exit, moving slowly through the crowd. Families were gathering together, taking pictures, hugging, laughing. The contrast was sharp, almost overwhelming. Everywhere I looked, there were moments being shared, memories being created. And yet, I felt separate from all of it, like I was moving through a scene that didn't quite belong to me anymore. As I reached the hallway outside the auditorium, the noise softened slightly, replaced by smaller groups of people talking in clusters. Some were still discussing the speech, their voices carrying fragments of surprise and curiosity. Did you hear what they said? That was unexpected. Do you think it was about someone specific? I kept walking, not wanting to stop, not wanting to be pulled into those conversations. I didn't have answers to give, and even if I did, I wasn't sure I was ready to say them out loud. Just as I was about to reach the main exit, someone stepped into my path. It was one of the event staff members holding a small envelope in their hand. "Excuse me," they said politely, looking directly at me. "This is for you." I paused, surprised. "For me?" They nodded and handed over without another word. There was no explanation, no extra detail. Just a simple exchange, as if it had been planned that way. I looked down at the envelope in my hand. It was plain, unmarked, with nothing written on the outside. For a moment, I just stared at it, my thoughts slowing, focusing entirely on this one unexpected detail. Something about it felt important, even before I opened it. Carefully, I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out a single piece of paper. My eyes moved quickly across the short message written inside. I know what they did, and I made sure the world would too. There was no name, no signature, nothing to indicate who had written it. I read it again, slower this time, letting each word settle. I know what they did. A quiet tension formed in my chest, and I made sure the world would too. My grip on the paper tightened slightly as the meaning began to sink in. This wasn't just a message. It was an explanation, or at least part of one. I looked up instinctively, scanning the area around me, as if the person who had written it might still be nearby. People moved past me, talking, laughing, completely unaware of what I was stood out. No one seemed to be watching. But the message felt real, intentional. This hadn't been random. My mind began to piece things together, connecting the speech, the timing, the way everything had unfolded. The speaker's words hadn't just been inspired by a general idea. They had been guided, shaped by something specific, by someone. I stepped aside, moving closer to the wall, trying to think more clearly. The noise around me faded again as my focus narrowed. If someone had known my situation well enough to describe it so accurately, then it meant they had access to something personal, something I hadn't openly shared. I thought back over the past few weeks, trying to remember if I had mentioned it to anyone, even casually. A friend, a classmate, someone I trusted. But nothing came to mind. I had kept it to myself, choosing silence over explanation. And yet someone had known, not just known, but acted on it. The idea that this had been planned sent a strange feeling through me. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something more complicated. A mix of surprise, confusion, and something else I couldn't fully define. I looked down at the note again, reading it one more time, searching for any hidden meaning, any clue that might point me in the right direction. But there was nothing more to find. The message was simple, direct, and intentionally incomplete. I made sure the world would too. That part stayed with me the most. It suggested something bigger than just the speech itself. Something beyond the auditorium, beyond the people who had been present in that moment. It hinted at a reach that extended further than I had realized. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope, holding it tightly for a moment as I considered what it meant. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted to comfort me or support me quietly. They had chosen something far more visible, far more public. They had turned my private disappointment into something that couldn't be ignored. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or unsettled. Part of me understood the intention, the desire to stand up for something that had been wrong. But another part of me couldn't ignore the fact that this had happened without my knowledge, without my permission. It was my story. And now, it had been shared with an entire room full of people. As I stepped back into the flow of movement toward the exit, I could feel the weight of that realization settling in. The speech, the message, the note, it was all connected, carefully arranged, deliberately executed. Someone had seen what I had gone through and decided to act, not quietly, not privately, but in a way that would make sure it couldn't be overlooked or dismissed. And as I walked out of the building, the sunlight hitting my face felt almost surreal, as if I had stepped out of one world and into another. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same anymore. Because whatever had just happened inside that auditorium wasn't just a moment. It was the beginning of something much bigger than I had expected after the envelope. Things began to unfold in a way I hadn't anticipated. I left the auditorium still feeling a mix of disbelief and confusion, clutching the note tightly, trying to make sense of it all. The words on that small slip of paper kept going in my mind. I know what they did, and I made sure the world would too. Who could have known so much? And more importantly, who had taken it upon themselves to expose it in such a public way? I had no answers, but I knew one thing for certain: this was no coincidence. Back home, I checked my phone again, expecting the usual notifications, message of friends sharing pictures and videos from the ceremony. But what I saw instead made my heart skip a beat. The moment from the ceremony, the part of the speech that had felt so directed at me, was everywhere. Clips were circulating online, shared across social media platforms, capturing the exact moment the speaker had addressed those parents. The video had been uploaded almost immediately, with thousands of views already piling up. Comments began appearing faster than I could read them, dozens per minute. How could anyone miss this moment? This student deserved so much better. I hope they see this and realize what they've lost. I sat down on the edge of my bed, my mind spinning. I didn't know how someone could have arranged this, how they had coordinated with the speaker and ensured that the world would see it. It wasn't just the speech itself. It was the way it had been delivered, timed perfectly, aimed directly at the empty seats. Whoever had done this had connections, influence, and a level of foresight that was staggering. Hours passed as I scrolled through the comments, reading reactions from strangers, friends, even classmates. The sheer number of people engaging with my story made it feel both surreal and oddly satisfying. It was like my pain, my quiet disappointment, had finally been acknowledged in the only way that truly mattered: publicly, visibly, undeniable. And somewhere in the background of all this, a realization began to take root. The revenge that had started quietly with the speech had now grown into something unstoppable. Then my phone buzzed. A single notification that made my chest tighten instantly. It was a message from an unknown number. I opened it with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The text was short, simple, but it made my entire body tense. Check your email. I quickly opened my email account, and there it was. A message from someone I recognized instantly. My older cousin. Someone I trusted. Someone I hadn't suspected would ever be involved in anything like this. I clicked it open, my eyes scanning the message as it loaded. I told them your story. The email began. I made sure the speaker knew everything they needed to make it count. They deserved it. You deserved it. Watch the response. For a moment, I froze. My cousin. They had been the one to orchestrate this. They had known the details of my experience and had worked behind the scenes to ensure the public exposure of my parents' absence. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but it was also exhilarating. This was beyond anything I had imagined. This wasn't just about attention or sympathy. It was a carefully planned act of retribution, a statement that could not be ignored. I leaned back, trying to process the scale of what had happened. It wasn't just the speaker or the note. It was the network of planning, the strategic timing, the understanding of exactly how the moment needed to unfold. Someone had seen the injustice of the situation and made it impossible to deny. I had been the quiet, invisible part of the story for so long, and now, suddenly, the world knew. The implications hit me as I reread the email. My parents would see this eventually. The social media posts, the viral clips, the comments from thousands of strangers. They would have no choice but to understand the weight of what they had missed. And it wasn't just embarrassment or shame. It was recognition, accountability, exposure on a scale that they could never escape. I thought back to the ceremony, remembering the precise moment when the speaker had addressed the absent parents. Every pause, every word, every glance felt deliberate in a way I had not appreciated fully in the moment. Now it all made sense. It hadn't been random or improvised. The timing had been intentional, orchestrated with care, designed to make the impact as public and undeniable as possible. For the first time, I felt the quiet surge of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not joy exactly, not satisfaction in a simple sense, but a deep, almost electric sense of vindication. All those years of being overlooked, ignored, dismissed, they weren't forgotten anymore. The world had seen, and my story had been acknowledged in a way that was permanent, indelible, impossible to deny. I realized that my cousin had not just helped me. They had taken my story and amplified it, turning it into a force that my parents couldn't control or ignore. It was exposure, yes, but it was also protection in a strange way. A public assertion of my worth. A reminder that my efforts, my accomplishments, my presence mattered. For so long I had hoped they would notice, silently praying for acknowledgement that never came. Now it had arrived, louder than I could have imagined, and I didn't have to ask for it. I stayed up late that night, scrolling through reactions, watching clips repeatedly, reading messages from strangers who expressed empathy, outrage, and admiration. The sense of disbelief gradually shifted into clarity. I was no longer just the student who had been ignored. I was the student whose story had been seen, whose absence had been noticed, whose parents' choice had been called out publicly in a way that couldn't be dismissed. Even with the excitement and the vindication, a strange mixture of emotions lingered. Gratitude for my cousin, awe at the speaker's precision, disbelief at the reach of it all. But beneath all of that was something quieter, deeper. A sense that things had changed forever. The narrative had shifted, and my parents' absence was no longer a pregnant disappointment. It had become something undeniable, something public, and something that would leave its mark far beyond the walls of the auditorium. And as I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, reading through yet another comment, another clip, another reaction, I realized that this was just the beginning. The exposure, the awareness, the realization of what had been lost. It wasn't something that could be undone or ignored. And somewhere deep inside, I felt the first true spark of empowerment that came not from revenge alone, but from finally being seen after the day of the ceremony. Life didn't return to normal the way I had expected. Everywhere I turned, there were reminders of what had happened, both subtle and obvious. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications, messages, tags, reposts, comments from people I barely knew, and friends who had witnessed the speech firsthand. Each one carried a mixture of surprise, admiration, and curiosity. Some messengers praised the speaker for their courage, others expressed shock at the parents' absence, and a few even asked if I was okay. I read them all, my emotions swinging between disbelief, pride, and a strange, quiet anger that I hadn't fully acknowledged before. The more I saw, the more I realized the impact of what had happened. The speech had gone beyond the walls of the auditorium. Clips had been uploaded online, snippets of the moment where the keynote speaker had called out the empty seats. The video had quickly gone viral, spreading across social media with thousands of views, comments, and shares. Every time I saw it, I felt a mixture of vindication and disbelief. People were talking about me, my absence, and the parents who had chosen not to show up. The humiliation and exposure were public, undeniable, and unavoidable. I began to notice the subtle ways people reacted around me. Classmates who had barely spoken to me before now offered congratulations, their smiles tinged with curiosity and surprise. Teachers who had always been formal suddenly seemed more attentive, nodding when they passed me in the hallway. Even strangers on social media reached out with messages of encouragement, as if they understood a pain I had never shared openly. The realization settled in that what had been private, a silent disappointment, a quiet hurt, had now been amplified and witnessed by the world. I tried to make sense of the note I had received from my cousin, the one that had set everything in motion. I know what they did, and I made sure the world would too. Those words no longer felt shocking. They felt deliberate, powerful, and strangely comforting. I understood now that my cousin had not acted recklessly but with careful precision, ensuring that the story would unfold in a way that was impossible to ignore. The timing, the speech, the delivery. It had all been coordinated to create the maximum impact, and it had worked. At home, I spent hours thinking about my parents, replaying every interaction I had ever had with them, every promise they had made and broken. For so long I had internalized their absence, excusing it, rationalizing it, hoping it was temporary. But now, everything was out in the open. Their choices were public, their neglect visible to the world. For the first time, I felt a strange sense of power. Not because I wanted revenge in a petty way, but because the truth was undeniable, and I no longer needed to hide my feelings or pretend it didn't matter. The next few days were surreal. Friends and classmates approached me repeatedly, asking questions about the speech, about the empty seats, about what had really happened. I answered as best as I could, careful not to reveal too much. But even in my answers, there was a sense of pride. The public acknowledgement had changed the dynamic. I wasn't invisible anymore. My absence had been noticed, my efforts had been recognized, and the world had seen what my parents had chosen to ignore. As the story continued to circulate online, I noticed reactions from a wider audience. People commented on the injustice of being ignored, the courage of the speaker, and the importance of accountability. Many shared similar experiences, thanking me indirectly for showing them that it was okay to feel disappointed and hurt when those who should support you failed to show up. The story had become bigger than my personal grievance. It had become a statement, a warning, and a form of empowerment for others who had felt invisible in their own lives. Through it all, I began to understand the subtle ways in which the situation had transformed me. I was no longer just a student who had been overlooked. I was someone whose story carried weight, whose experience had been validated, and whose emotions had been seen by thousands of people. The exposure, which had once felt like humiliation, now felt like liberation. The absence that had once felt like a wound had been transformed into a form of acknowledgement, a turning point that forced me to see myself differently. And yet, there was still the unresolved tension of the personal aspect. The parents themselves. I knew they would eventually see the video, hear the stories, and feel the consequences of their absence. I didn't know how they would react or whether they would understand the magnitude of what had happened. But that wasn't entirely my concern anymore. The world had already witnessed it, and that was enough. I began to notice small changes in my daily life. Teachers treated me with more respect, classmates looked at me differently, and even strangers online offered messages of support. The narrative had shifted entirely. I was no longer defined by their absence but by the recognition and validation I had received from the broader world. And somewhere in the midst of all this attention, I realized something important: the story wasn't over. It was evolving, growing, and creating ripples that would extend far beyond the moment in the auditorium. With every share, every comment, every view, I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the absence, the neglect, and the disappointment had been transformed into visibility. My pain had been acknowledged. My experience had been validated, and the public recognition, orchestrated with precision, had created a turning point I could never have achieved on my own. Even with all the reactions, all the attention, and all the recognition, there was a stillness inside me that I hadn't felt before. It wasn't complete relief, and it wasn't closure, but it was something stronger, a sense of control. A sense that my story now mattered, and that my voice, my presence, and my experiences could not be ignored by anyone, no matter how important they thought they were. And as the days continued to pass, I realized that the exposure, the acknowledgement, and the validation had done more than I had expected. It had changed me, shifted the balance, and created a moment that would stay with me forever, because now, I knew the story had power. After the initial shock of the speech, and the viral clips began to settle, I started noticing the subtler effects of what had happened. It wasn't just the immediate recognition, the attention from classmates, or the comments online. It was the way people began treating me differently, almost instinctively, as if something had shifted in the air around me. Teachers who had once passed me with cursory nods now lingered a moment longer, asking questions about my future plans. Classmates, even those who had never spoken to me before, offered congratulations with a mix of curiosity and admiration. Strangers online sent messages expressing empathy, sharing their own stories of being overlooked or dismissed. It was as if my personal story had created a ripple, reaching beyond my immediate world, connecting with people in ways I had never imagined. Even with all of this, the memory of the empty seats and the silence remained vivid. I remembered the precise moment the speaker's words had hit me, the way they had held the audience's attention while simultaneously directing an invisible spotlight on my absence of parental support. That memory had been transformed from a painful, private wound into a public acknowledgement that could no longer be ignored. And yet, there was something almost surreal about seeing the reactions unfold. It wasn't just validation, it was exposure on a scale that made the experience almost unbelievable. I began to think more about the person behind it all, my cousin. The email, the orchestration of the speech, the careful timing, the viral clips. They had seen my struggle, recognized the injustice, and decided to act. Not in a quiet, private way, but in a way that would leave no room for denial or excuse. They had taken a story that was mine alone and turned it into a public statement, ensuring that it could not be minimized, ignored, or forgotten. I felt a mixture of awe and gratitude, but also a strange, simmering sense of empowerment that I hadn't expected. As the hours turned into days, I began to notice the subtle ways in which my parents' absence was being discussed, though not directly to me. Friends and acquaintances would make passing comments, small hints, carefully phrased observations about accountability, about the importance of showing up when it matters. It wasn't malicious, but it was a constant reminder that the world had noticed, and that the absence I had endured in silence was now something undeniable. The thought of my parents seeing the viral clips and the widespread reaction made my chest tighten. I didn't know exactly when they would realize how publicly their absence had been exposed, but I knew they would. And when they did, The confrontation wouldn't be private. It wouldn't be a simple conversation in the quiet of home. The truth had been made public, and the weight of their choices would be impossible to ignore. The realization that their absence had been witnessed, commented on, and shared by thousands was both satisfying and terrifying in a way I hadn't anticipated. Amid the swirl of social media posts, comments, and discussions, I began to feel a deeper sense of clarity about my own position. I was no longer simply the student who had been overlooked. I had become the person whose story had been seen, whose experience had been validated, and whose pain had been recognized in a way that could not be minimized. The exposure had given me a form of agency, a sense that my life, my accomplishments, and my emotions mattered in a tangible, undeniable way. And yet, with all the recognition came a quiet, simmering intensity inside me. This wasn't just relief or pride. It was a feeling of power, tempered by the memory of the absence that had caused it. For years, I had carried that disappointment silently, excusing it, rationalizing it, trying to make sense of why those who should have cared the most were not there. But now, the public acknowledgement had shifted the balance. The narrative had changed, and I was no longer powerless in it. I spent hours replaying the clips of the speech, watching the reactions, reading the comments, trying to understand the full impact. Each viewing revealed something new. The careful phrasing of the speaker, the subtle pauses, the way the story had been directed to highlight what had been missing. I could see clearly now that it had been intentional, that the exposure had been calculated to make the truth impossible to ignore. It was precise, almost surgical in its execution, and the more I watched, the more I understood the scale of what had been done on my behalf. The realization that my cousin had been the architect behind it all added a new layer to my understanding. Their intervention had not only amplified my story, but it had also ensured that it resonated beyond the immediate audience. The viral nature of the clips, the way social media spread the moment, and the reactions it triggered, all of it was part of a carefully considered plan. I felt a surge of gratitude and a deep sense of awe at the precision with which they had acted, but also an awareness that this was something I could never have achieved alone. Even as the attention continued to grow, a quiet thought lingered in the back of my mind. This was not just about recognition. It was about justice, accountability, and the power of visibility. The exposure of my parents' absence had created a moment that could not be denied, and it had forced acknowledgement in a way that nothing else could. It wasn't revenge in the petty sense. It was truth, public and undeniable, and it had shifted the entire dynamic of my story. With each passing day, I felt the shift inside me becoming more permanent. The sense of power, validation, and acknowledgement was no longer fleeting. It was transforming my perspective, shaping how I viewed my achievements, my relationships, and my own worth. The experience had become a turning point, a moment that would influence not just my present, but the way I approached the future. And in the quiet moments, when I reflected on the speech, the viral clips, and the public acknowledgement, I realized that something fundamental had changed. Not just in the eyes of the world, but in my own understanding of myself, because the moment had become more than a ceremony. More than a speech, more than exposure. The days after the viral speech were unlike anything I had imagined. Life seemed to move in slow motion, each interaction layered with a new meaning, every glance or comment carrying weight I hadn't anticipated. Social media was flooded with posts about the graduation, the speech, and the empty seats that had become a symbol of absence and neglect. Strangers reached out to me, sharing their own experiences of disappointment, neglect, and the complicated relationships they had with their families. Some were heartfelt messages. Others were simply expressions of shock or admiration for the way the speaker had handled the situation. I read them all, feeling a strange mixture of validation and disbelief. The story that had been mine alone was now shared, dissected, and acknowledged by thousands of people I had never met. Amidst all this, I began to notice subtle shifts in the way my parents interacted with me. Or, more accurately, the way they avoided interacting. Calls went unanswered, messages were vague and clipped, and any attempt at conversation seemed forced. I wasn't sure what they were thinking, but it was obvious that the speech, the viral videos, and the public attention had unsettled them. For the first time, the absence that had felt like a private pain was now a visible scar, one that they could no longer ignore. I didn't feel triumphant, exactly, but there was a quiet sense of satisfaction knowing that the truth had been laid bare, and there was no room left for denial. The more I reflected on the experience, the more I realized how orchestrated it had all been. My cousin had played a central role in turning a moment of private hurt into a public statement. The note, the coordination with the speaker, the timing of the speech, all of it had been carefully planned to ensure maximum impact. At first, I had felt a mixture of shock and confusion at how much had been revealed without my input. But over time, I began to understand the brilliance behind it. This wasn't just exposure, it was empowerment. It was a deliberate act of justice, crafted to ensure that my story could not be ignored or dismissed. I found myself replaying the speech over and over in my mind, remembering the precise way the speaker had addressed the empty seats, the pauses, the deliberate emphasis on accountability and presence. Every detail had been designed to make an impact, and the impact had been profound. It wasn't just the attention or the validation that mattered. It was the undeniable truth of the moment, the fact that my parents' absence had been made visible to everyone. That visibility had shifted something fundamental, both externally in the way people treated me and internally in the way I saw myself. The online reactions continued to pour in. Each video view, comment, and share felt like another layer of acknowledgement. Strangers expressed outrage at what my parents had missed, admiration for my perseverance, and gratitude for the courage to let this story be seen. Friends and classmates offered support, some with disbelief, some with genuine concern, but all with a recognition that I had endured something significant and had been wronged in a way that demanded notice. The public acknowledgement was no longer just about embarrassment for those who had missed the ceremony. It was about validating my experience and ensuring that my efforts were recognized in a way that could not be diminished. I began to understand that this was a simple act of revenge or exposure. It was a statement about accountability, about the importance of showing up when it truly matters. For years, I had internalized the hurt, excusing my parents' absence, trying to rationalize it, and even doubting my own worth. But now, that absence had been highlighted in a way that forced recognition. The story had grown beyond my personal disappointment and had become a broader message about responsibility, attention, and the consequences of neglect. Even in quiet moments, the weight of what had happened lingered. The memory of the speech, the viral clips, and the reactions it triggered reminded me that my pain had been acknowledged, not just privately, but publicly. That acknowledgement carried a strange form of liberation. For the first time, I felt the power of my story being validated externally, of the truth I had carried silently being confirmed by the reactions of others. The experience had shifted the dynamics of my relationships, my self-perception, and my understanding of what it meant to be truly seen. My parents eventually reached out, though cautiously, their tone and words careful, measured, almost defensive. I wasn't sure what to say, how to respond, or if there was even anything to say that could undo the exposure or the impact. But I realized quickly that this wasn't about confrontation or reconciliation in the traditional sense. It was about understanding that my absence had been noticed and that their choices had consequences that could not be ignored. Their discomfort and hesitation only reinforced the power of what had occurred. I began to reflect on the long-term implications of the event. This wasn't just a momentary sensation or viral story. It was a turning point in my life. The acknowledgement, exposure, and validation had shifted something fundamental within me. I was no longer just a student who had been overlooked. I was someone whose story mattered, whose efforts had been recognized, and whose experiences could not be dismissed. That realization carried a quiet but profound sense of empowerment, one that I knew would influence the way I approached future challenges, relationships, and opportunities. The role of my cousin, the careful orchestration of the speech, and the public exposure all contributed to a feeling of justice that was hard to describe. It wasn't about revenge for its own sake. It was about visibility, accountability, and acknowledgement. My story, which had once been private and quietly painful, had been transformed into something public and undeniable. That transformation created a sense of closure, but also of strength. It was a reminder that the truth, when presented in the right way, could not be ignored or diminished. As I continued to process everything, I understood something deeper about the event. It had revealed not only the absence of my parents, but also the power of intervention, the impact of advocacy, and the importance of timing and strategy. My cousin had taken a moment that was private, painful, and potentially isolating and transformed it into a public statement that could not be denied. That lesson about the importance of support, preparation, and courage would stay with me long after the applause had faded and the social media posts had slowed. And as the weeks passed, I realized that what had begun as a painful, overlooked moment had evolved into a turning point in my life. The exposure, the acknowledgement, and the public validation had given me a sense of control and power I hadn't experienced before. I could see clearly now that the absence I had once internalized had been transformed into something far more meaningful. A story that had been witnessed, recognized, and respected by the world because in the end, what mattered wasn't just the ceremony, or the speech, or even the viral attention. It was that my experience had finally been seen, acknowledged, and made impossible to ignore. Thank you so much for watching this story unfold. What started as a quiet disappointment became a powerful reminder that our worth isn't defined by who shows up, or who doesn't. Sometimes, life gives us moments that feel unfair, but those same moments can transform into opportunities for growth, recognition, and even unexpected justice. Remember, your efforts, your struggles, and your achievements are never invisible, even when it feels like they are. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that reveal the truth behind the moments we all experience. And let us know in the comments, have you ever faced a moment where someone unexpectedly stood up for you? Your story matters, and you never know who might be watching and ready to make a difference. Stay strong, stay visible, and always remember that sometimes the world notices even when the people closest to us don't.